Have you ever met someone and asked them their sun, moon, and rising sign only to find that they appear to be nothing like their big three? First house planets may be the culprit. You see, the first house in astrology represents you very literally. And when you have planets in your first house, using whole sign houses of course, the energy of these influences don't simply merge with the energy of your rising sign. Often they're actually completely overpowering. These planets impact everything in your life. Contrary to what pop astrology has taught you, the first house is not just about your physical appearance and your outward expression of personality. It is so much more than that. Understanding your first house is the gateway to understanding yourself, your place in the world, major life events and life themes, and even important aspects of your health and your well-being. In this video, we'll cover everything you need to know to understand your first house, along with all of the planets that may live there in your birth chart. If this sounds exciting to you, you're definitely in the right place, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an important astrology tutorial and update just like this one. And if you're truly passionate about learning astrology, but you're left feeling like an imposter when you go to put all of the pieces together to give readings, I have a free gift for you. On April 30th of 2024, in case you're watching this well into the future, I'm teaching a free workshop all about how to become a confident astrologer in less than 1 year. This workshop is your 365-day roadmap to go from struggling to put all of the pieces together to giving meaningful, accurate astrology readings and making predictions so you can navigate your own life, help your friends and family, and even give paid professional astrology readings with confidence. Make sure you register at the link down in the description below to access the live workshop, to join us live in real time, or to get the replay. And if you're really serious about giving readings, the Cosmic Academy of Astrology will be opening for enrollment very soon at the end of this month, and you'll be getting a massive discount and all sorts of bonuses, so just keep an eye out for that as well. So before we get into the significations of all of the different planets in the first house, we need to discuss what the first house actually represents in astrology, so we have a context for this. And so the first house represents your innate personality. It's who you are and the way that you show up in the world. And it's not just some mask you wear. It's a true part of who you are. It represents not just this innate way of being and navigating the world, but it's also the behaviors, the personality traits, the way that you go about navigating your life that was deemed acceptable or encouraged in your early childhood experience. And so often we learn to grow into our rising sign, and we learn to lean into our rising sign because it's what was deemed acceptable in early life. And so when we're older, especially when we first meet someone, especially when we encounter a new situation, we often default to that rising sign experience, to that rising sign expression, because we already know that it works, it's acceptable, it was encouraged. And so that is what we use usually upon first meeting someone, and that's usually the first thing that people see as a result of that. The rising sign is not the only thing that impacts our personalities, of course. We have a whole spectrum of things going on in our birth chart, but it is so predominant because we know it works. And so not only are we born with these innate personality traits, but we build upon them and refine them throughout our lifetime because it has proven useful. And even casual astrologers know that the first house represents the physical body and your appearance, and that's absolutely the case. You can learn a lot about what a person will look like, and you can connect back what a person looks like to their rising sign and the planets in their first house. But it's beyond just what you look like. It's your entire body, your entire physical incarnation, your physical form. The first house represents your health, your body, the way it functions, the way it feels, and the way that it looks and the way that other people view it. And so the first house is a huge player when it comes to medical astrology and understanding your health. The first house represents the general overall state of the body, along with constitution and resilience to disease. It can also show issues that show up early in life around the time of birth or gestation, so stuff that you were born with in terms of physical weaknesses or physical strength. strengths. And so navigating that energy of the first house is very important. It shows your overall constitution and what you were born with when it comes to your physical incarnation and how that impacts your health as a whole. And speaking of birth, an individual's birth story can often be found in the first house and near the ascendant, including things like complications that occurred around the time of birth. And finally, and probably most importantly, the first house represents major life themes and events that are so important and so impactful that they shape your personality. They shape who you are in this world. You can see through the first house and its connections who actually played a role in shaping your personality, who played a role in shaping your life experience. You can see what those life experiences actually looked like or might look like well into the future. You can see recurrent themes and patterns and experiences that when you look at your life as if it was like a storybook, these are some of the main chapters. These are some of the pivotal moments. These are some of the things that you'll come back to time and time again. And so the first house impacts you in so many ways. It's not just the way you show up or the way people see you. It's not just your physical appearance. It's everything. It has to do with who you are and your entire life experience. Not only that, but the first house sets up the entire house system in your birth chart. Essentially, when we're looking at the houses, we're looking at the first house and the ascendant as being you, and all of the other houses in the birth chart being everything that you experience in respect to you. These are your career goals. These are your career experiences. These are other people in your life. These are your family dynamics. These are your friendships. These are your financial situations in respect to you as the first house. And so the first house is the central focus of the entire chart because it sets the stage for everything that occurs in your entire life. Yes, the first house is that important. Now, before we jump into the significations of all of the planets in the first house, I know some of you are already asking, but Heather, I don't have any planets in the first house. What do I do? In that case, you're going to want to look to the first house ruler or the chart ruler, and you're going to want to check out this video that's floating around somewhere up here. You can do that after, or you can sit through this video and maybe learn a thing or two about your friends and family first. All right, so let's get into the planetary expressions in the first house. And one thing I should mention is that these planetary influences are going to become much more powerful the closer these planets are to the actual ascendant, because the ascendant is a point of power, it's a point of significant influence, and it's a concentrated focal point of energy. And so when you have the sun or the moon or Pluto right on the ascendant, you're going to feel that more strongly. And if you have a stellium of planets in your first house, if you have a bunch of different planets that you're working with there, the strongest influences, the ones that are going to be more felt and more conveyed through your personality and through your experience, are going to be the ones that are closest in degree to the ascendant. And so let's start with the sun, because the sun is the central focus of our solar system, and it is a very prominent, very powerful influence in our birth chart, regardless of whether or not it's in the first house. The sun, as you probably already know, is the ruler of the sign of Leo, and having the sun in the first house can bring Leo-like qualities to an individual. Oftentimes, especially if the sun is also in a fire sign, so in Aries or in Sagittarius, this person can come off very Leo, where you're kind of like, are you sure you're not a Leo sun sign or a Leo rising sign? Because that energy is just so potent. And because Leo as a sign gets a lot of its significations from that rulership, from that connection with the sun, the solar energy. And so people who have the sun in the first house, regardless of the sign, but especially those fire energies, can be much more flamboyant, much more gregarious, much more optimistic, much more flashy, showy, outgoing. They tend to be very generous, very authentic, very heart-centered. They tend to be very much who they are. And so what you see is what you get with somebody who has the sun in the first house, because their sun and rising sign are in alignment. These people show up very much as they are in a way that's very integral, that's very, like I mentioned before, authentic. And authenticity can be a key word for somebody who has the sun in the first house. For certain placements with the sun in the first house, they can also be a little bit more dramatic. They like to be the center of attention. They like to be the center of other people's reality, of their world, of their focus when they're together with another person. They tend to take over a room even when they're not trying to, even when they don't intentionally or consciously want to be a central focus. Their energy is such that all eyes are on them. Everybody notices. And their energy is very magnetic. Like, people really tend to like and gravitate toward people who have really strong sun energies in the first house, with certain exceptions, of course. You have to look at what sign the sun is in and what aspects it's making. If it's all full of squares and, the sun is at its detriment and all this other stuff, then maybe not quite as likable, but still like a very nice energy where people are going to take notice. These people often do really well in leadership positions, and because the sun is the general significator of the father, the biological father often plays a huge role in shaping that person's personality, even more so than with the average person, and that could be for better or for worse. Oftentimes you'll see, some people who have the sun in the first house might have a father that wasn't around or that they didn't really get along with. And so they tend to use that as an example of what not to be, and it shapes their personality very strongly. On the flip side, they might have had a close relationship with their father, and they emulate this man in their life, and they grow up to be, just like him or very similar to him in some way. And that could be with male or female chart types. And so it's not just restricted to, men growing up to be like their fathers. Women can emulate their fathers and grow up to have similar personality traits as a result of having that sun in the first house as well. But again, it could be the opposite. It could be that they didn't have a very good experience with this person, and that really shaped their personality, and it led them to go in a completely different direction. Or it could be that they didn't have an experience that was very positive with this person, and unbeknownst to them, they become just like that person. And that's kind of the most negative expression, I would say, of that sun in the first house father connection, if it's there. The first house has a double health emphasis when the sun is there, because the sun is the ruler of our vitality. It's our life force energy. It has a lot to do with our overall health and well-being, and so does the first house. And so when you put these together in the first house and what the sun is doing becomes doubly important when it comes to your overall health and well-being. A strongly placed sun that likes where it's at and is really positively supported by other planets in the birth chart can indicate very strong vitality, can indicate somebody who's very healthy and very vibrant. Whereas a weak sun in the first house can indicate that a person's lack of vitality predominates and is a big influence on a person's life and a person's experience. And because the sun is a warm energy, it is the light that heats up everything on this planet. The sun in the first house can indicate that a person runs a little warm. They have kind of a hot constitution, and so that could be part of that as well. And going back to that tie to the physical body and physical appearance with the sun, because the sun is that connection with the sign of Leo, sometimes you can find that people who have the sun in their first house can have like very Leo hair, where their hair stands out in some way. It's not quite as over the top or in your face as it will be if they are an actual Leo rising, but you will often see something interesting with a person's hair. People with the sun in the first house are often very goal-driven and very ambitious, and they do very well in leadership positions or leadership roles. People tend to naturally look toward these people as authority figures, like they know what they're doing, they know what they're talking about, and often it's because they tend to have a lot of self-confidence. And so studies have shown that it's not necessarily somebody's intelligence or their skills that makes them a good leader or that makes people trust them as a leader. It's their confidence. And so people who have this position, unless their sun is heavily afflicted, they tend to have that confidence and they tend to do very well in leadership positions. And so for the moon in the first house, the moon, as you already know, is the ruler of the sign of Cancer. And so the moon in the first house can give someone a Cancer-like quality to their appearance and to their personality. They tend to be much more receptive, much more nurturing, much more emotionally driven and emotionally expressive, and much more intuitive and empathic. The moon in the first house makes it very hard for you to hide your emotions. You wear your emotions right front and center on your sleeve, and usually your emotions are expressed in a way that is a little over the top. Even if you don't want it to be so, you might think that that's not you, but people can read you like a book. Even when you don't want people to know what you're feeling, your face and your body language and your energy will absolutely give it away. Kind of a, side note here, a funny story. Our dog, Luna, was born with her moon in the first house. She's also a Cancer. I didn't name her. She came with that name, believe it or not. And she exhibits those exact same personality traits that I would expect with somebody who has the moon in their first house. When she feels something, she feels it and expresses it with her whole body, her whole energy. It is way over the top, even for a dog. And so this holds true for all species. And it's just something that tends to be a very predominant trait for people who have moon in the first house. Just like the sun is the general significator of the father, the biological father in the birth chart, the moon is the general significator for the biological mother. And similar to what we discussed with the sun, the moon in the first house can indicate that the person's mother had a big influence on shaping your personality, the way you show up in the world. It could be, if the moon is heavily afflicted, that your mother wasn't in the picture, or, you didn't have a good relationship, and so you use that as an example of what not to be. It could also be that you have a very close, very beautiful, really wonderful relationship with your mother, and you use that as an example of who to emulate, who to be just like. And this could be for, a man's chart or a woman's chart. It does not matter. It could also be that, you find yourself with age becoming more and more like your mother, even though you don't necessarily want that to be the case. And so regardless, it's part of our fate that the mother becomes extra, extra important to the life story and the major life themes and influences that shape who you are and the way that you navigate your world. But it also becomes a bigger, more potent influence on your personality, on the way that you actually show up. And you might even find that a lot of people tell you that, you look just like your mother, you remind me of your mother, that type of thing. Again, not always the case, because some people might not have, a mother who's in the picture. But again, it's a similar thing where that specific circumstance has a huge influence on your life and your life path and who you are. And so that's a big part of this as well. The first house also has a double health influence when the moon is positioned there, just like with the sun, because the moon in traditional astrology is the general significator of the body and bodily health. And so we have this energy of the first house being your actual physical body and your physical incarnation, and the moon, which is a general significator of the body and your physical health. Because the moon is so closely tied in with your emotions and your inner world, your subjective reality and experience, your feelings and your emotions have a massive impact, not just on what you're expressing and the way people are seeing you, but on your body and your bodily health and the way your body feels. Also, the fluids of the body can take on a more predominant influence and be much more important when it comes to your overall health, along with other moon significations when it comes to medical astrology, like ovarian hormones, the womb, the stomach, all of those types of things. And that could be a really positive thing where those are strengthened, or a really challenging thing where those are, weakened. It just depends on the position of the moon. Is it in its detriment or fall, or is it in its exaltation or rulership? Is it nicely aspected with other planets, or is it afflicted? We have to look at the whole picture to really see what that means. But in general, what it means is that there is a heightened sensitivity of that area, or a heightened importance of those bodily functions. And so that's something to just make note of as well. People who have the moon in the first house often have a very strong memory function, and this also has to do a little bit with medical astrology and those significations, because the moon does rule over our memory along with Mercury. The moon rules the limbic system of the brain, and the limbic system is where emotional memory and episodic memory are housed. And so oftentimes you'll see that people who have moon in the first house have amazing memory function, like beyond what you could ever imagine, like where you're like, how did you remember something when you were 2 years old when you shouldn't have been able to form memories? And going back to the example of our dog who has the moon in the first house, she is deaf and blind. And the most incredible thing is that she walks into a room when she first goes in there, like if we're in an Airbnb or a place we've never visited before, and she rubs her whole body around everything just once, and then she remembers where all of it is, and she can run around the room like completely aimless without running into things. Like her memory is that good. And so people who have moon in the first house have a similar experience where they're like the elephant that never forgets. And one final thing, kind of still connected to that moon limbic system kind of health connection, is that the limbic system is very tied to the olfactory centers of the brain, to smell. And so people who have moon in the first house, I've noticed, tend to have a heightened sense of smell, or they're very sensitive to smell. And smell does trigger memory and emotion for that very reason, because it's tied in with the limbic system. So just a little quirky thing about people who have moon in the first house. And then with Mercury in the first house, Mercury rules the signs of Gemini and of Virgo. And people who have Mercury in their first house tend to take on both Gemini and Virgo qualities, usually a combination of the two, because Mercury informs some of the significations of both Gemini and Virgo. People who have Mercury in an air sign in the first house tend to take on more of those Gemini-like qualities. So especially if they're in Libra or Aquarius, or definitely if it's actually in Gemini. People who have Mercury in the earth signs, so in especially Virgo, but also Capricorn and Taurus, tend to take on more of those Virgo-like qualities with Mercury in the first house. But this can look like being very talkative, very inquisitive, very quick-witted, very social, very detail-oriented, very practical and pragmatic. It can look like being a very rational, logical thinker. It can look like being perfectionistic in a lot of different things. It can look like thinking things through and overthinking things and talking things to death sometimes, depending on what is going on with Mercury in your first house. It can look like oversharing information, especially with Mercury in certain placements. My husband has Mercury in Sagittarius, which is at its detriment. And Sagittarius is all about expansion and kind of overlooking the details and, maybe taking things a little too far. And he does tend to be someone who overshares information. And so it's just one example of many, many. I'm not going to call out a bunch of my clients or anything like that, with Mercury in the first house being just very, very talkative, very socially engaged, and prone to maybe even sharing a little bit too much, because they just love to be engaged in conversation. They love to have their mind working. They tend to be very highly intelligent. And as long as Mercury is not afflicted in their first house, they do tend to have a strong, balanced nervous system. They tend to be very easily able to think on their feet. They tend to have very good cognitive function, memory function. However, if Mercury is afflicted, it might be exactly the opposite. And one of their predominant features is that their brain is muddled, or they have trouble thinking things through, or they have some sort of issue with their nervous system even. So you really do have to look at what Mercury is doing in terms of the planetary energies. But in general, there's an emphasis on the brain, the nervous system, logical thought, and communication with Mercury in the first house. Because Mercury is a fast-moving planet, these people do tend to be kind of quick in their movements. They tend to be smaller in stature, I've noticed, with that Mercury, and that's in respect to their genetics. And so if they come from a family of people that are 6'5", maybe being small in stature is being 6'1", right? And so you have to look at these things in the context of their family lineage and their biology, but they do tend to be a little bit more compact, a little bit more sprite-like, a little bit quicker quick in their movements. They tend to have really nice hands, and they're a lot of really good like manual dexterity, really good at working with their hands, things like that as well, because Mercury obviously rules the function of the fingers, the hands, all of that. I'm like flickering around over here. And then we get into Venus. Venus can take on a Taurus or a Libra-like quality when it comes to their rising sign and the way that they show up in the world, the way other people perceive them, the way they navigate, because Venus rules the signs of Taurus and of Libra. And so usually you'll get that combination of energies playing itself out with whatever the rising sign actually is. And for those who have an Earth rising sign, they tend to lean more toward those Taurus expressions. So especially obviously if Venus is in Taurus, they're like an extra Taurus rising. But also if they have it in Virgo or in Capricorn, it'll be a little bit more Taurus, but more practical and pragmatic and a little less luxurious, maybe a little less extravagant. And if they have Venus in an air sign in the first house, especially of course in Libra, they'll be like an ultra Libra, but even in Aquarius or in Gemini, they'll take on more of those Libra qualities than the Taurus qualities, whereas everyone else will be kind of a healthy combination of the two. And so people who have Venus in the first house, first off, they tend to be very attractive, very aesthetically pleasing, and they're prone to focusing on aesthetics and material sensory pleasure. They know how to indulge in the physical experience, especially when it comes to things that are pleasurable to the physical body. And that's not just sexual pleasure, that's things like massages, food, really nice fabrics, really nice smells and perfumes. They really enjoy indulging in the material world in that way. It's not always that they want to just buy really expensive, luxurious things. They just want to have experiences of luxury in their physical form and in their physical body. But they do tend, especially, in the earth signs to, really like to have nice things, really beautiful material possessions. They really, are aesthetically inclined. They can be very artistic, especially when it comes to the visual arts and things like sculpting, perfume making, like music, really any type of art, really. People with Venus in the first house tend to be very likable. They're very charismatic. They're also very easily able to kind of reflect back to other people what they're saying, what they're doing, mirroring their mannerisms, that type of thing, because of that reciprocity of Venus. And they tend to have really beautiful reciprocal relationships with other people. They tend to be the peacekeepers and the peacemakers unless Venus is heavily afflicted in some way. And so they do tend to have really solid, really positive relationships. And they do tend to be the drivers of those relationships. And so they seek out relationship as opposed to the other way around more times than not. And they are very responsible for the way their relationships play out. In general, Venus in the first house is considered to be positive for health and for well-being because Venus is a benefic planet. But if it does cause problems, especially if Venus is afflicted, it could be indulgences, right? I mentioned this material sensory experience. They can be very indulgent when it comes to sweets, especially. Venus rules sugar. They can be indulgent when it comes to other sensory pleasures that can lead to, disease later on down the line. Also, because Venus is relaxed, they can become lazy, or they can have relaxed muscle tone that's too relaxed, or weaknesses in their body due to too much laxity and relaxation. And so those things are worth making note of, but in general, it is more of a positive indicator. And so people who have Venus in the first house, they tend to be more balanced in their mannerisms. They tend to be more balanced in, the homeostatic systems of the body. They tend to fare pretty well when it comes to their overall health. It's not like this excessive energy of having a ton of like Mars or the sun even, where it's just like burning through vitality, burning through energy. But they tend not to be, too lazy or too indulgent either. They tend to have a really good balance when it comes to the way that they navigate their world and a work-life balance even. And just like with the previous planets we discussed, people who have Mars in the first house can take on a lot of the traits of the signs that are ruled by Mars when it comes to the way that they express their energy through their first house and through their rising sign. And so Mars in modern astrology rules Aries, and in traditional astrology it rules Scorpio. And so people who have Mars in the first house tend to take on this combination of Aries and Scorpio energy. And if they have a lot of fire, so let's say they have a fire sign in the first house and Mars is in Aries especially, they'd be like an ultra Aries, but Leo or Sagittarius, they tend to be more of the Aries type versus people who have Mars in the water signs. So especially Mars in Scorpio would be like an ultra Scorpio, but you know, Mars in Cancer or Mars in the sign of Pisces might come across like a little bit of a different type of Scorpio. And so people who have Mars in Aries tend to be very determined, very strong-willed, very optimistic, very enthusiastic. They tend to want what they want when they want it, and they know how to make it happen. They tend to be very fierce, very penetrating. They tend to have a very interesting appearance when it comes to their eyes. Either they'll have those Aries eyes, like the big you know, eyes that you see when it comes to Aries and kind of that Aries forehead, or they'll have the penetrating Scorpio stare. And I'm sure you guys know exactly what I'm talking about there, except with the Mars, it tends to be much more intense. It's much more of an active stare, if that makes sense. You'll know it when you see it. Find someone with Mars in a water sign in their first house and talk to them for a little while. You'll know exactly what I mean by that. But these people are extremely powerful and extremely strong-willed. They will get what they need. They will make things happen. They are the person that you want to call on if you need something to get done. They're especially good at getting things started because that's the Mars energy of initiation and action. Not maybe as good at seeing things through, but they know how to accomplish things. They're very ambitious, very driven. Mars is also very hot, so they tend to run hot. They can be more prone to, you know, rashes and fevers and inflammation. Constitutionally, they tend to be just much more heated up. And, you know, Mars is considered a malefic planet in traditional astrology, and so it's not necessarily considered a positive influence to have it in the first house, especially if it's afflicted and there's other things going on there. And so Mars in the first house can indicate health issues or being prone to accidents, especially because that's very Mars, wounds, cuts, you know, surgeries. It could be someone who's more prone to burns, even if it's just sunburns, somebody who's more prone to, you know, inflammation and heat and things like fevers. And so, you know, that's not always the best thing, but they do tend to have a lot of energy and a lot of vitality, and they can really will themselves out of anything. And so even though they can find themselves getting into certain predicaments, especially because that Mars energy is very fast and very pushy and they just kind of go for it, and that can lead to hazards and accidents, right? That impulsivity of Mars in the first house, they usually can, you know, figure out a way to make it work or to recover. Mars is the planet of anger and frustration, and these people are quick to anger and can become easily frustrated. These are the people who will fight for what they want and fight for what they believe in, and they can come across as being abrasive or harsh in a lot of ways, and so sometimes that can be off-putting. And so even though they're not necessarily intending to be mean, they're not necessarily intending to, you know, fight you on something, it can come off that way sometimes, and they don't even realize it because they're just so focused on doing the thing and getting it done and accomplishing their goals that they might not notice, right? They might not be thinking or considering your needs or your viewpoint on something. And so, you know, it does lead to accelerated like forms of conflict. It can lead to that person being more prone to having arguments and disputes and disagreements. However, it can also lead to them being a motivating force for others. And so this is not all bad, you guys. And so these people people have such high energy, such high motivation, such high optimism that they can be very inspirational to others, and they do make good leaders. They're not very good followers. You don't want to tell a Mars in the first house person what to do and how to do it, but they'll tell you what to do and how to do it. And a lot of times they're right, and they're good at that, and they're good at lighting a fire under other people. And so that can be a really wonderful thing when it's used in that way. Mars in the first house people, because they do have so much fire, so much energy, they do require a lot of physical activity. They tend to have, good muscle tone. They tend to move about the world a lot. And so they're not somebody who can just sit still and like do nothing. They have to be doing and going and moving. And if they don't get that, so especially in childhood, let's say in this day and age, a Mars in the first house kid would probably be diagnosed more easily and more readily with something like ADHD, or they might, get notes home from the teacher that they're having behavioral problems, because they're not meant to, no child is meant to just sit there for 8 hours, but this child in particular is definitely not meant to sit still and sit there for 8 hours straight. People who have this energy need to burn through it. Otherwise, they are prone to nervousness, they're prone to anxiety, they're prone to outbursts, they're prone to anger, they're prone to frustration, they're prone to all of these things that are associated with Mars in the first house, but they don't necessarily have to have these negative expressions, you guys. So if you have Mars in the first house, move your body. If you're not moving your body, that's when all the problems of Mars come out. And so as long as you're recognizing that Mars is there and that you need to act on your will, you need to move about the world, you need to exercise a lot, you're going to be just fine. With Jupiter in the first house, just like the planets that we talked about prior, Jupiter rules the signs of Sagittarius and Pisces, and having Jupiter in the first house can give someone who's not a Sagittarius and not a Pisces, Sagittarian and Piscean qualities through their expression of their first house and their rising sign. And so with Jupiter being in the fire signs in particular, so in Sagittarius, of course, this would be an ultra Sagittarius person, but with the Jupiter placement in the sign of Leo or Aries, they might come across as being like an Aries Sagittarius combo or a Leo Sagittarius combo. And I've seen this in action, especially with that Aries. Jupiter in the water signs, even if it's not Pisces, can give them a more dreamy, optimistic, hopeful, Piscean quality. So, Jupiter in Cancer or Jupiter in the sign of Scorpio even, although that's a little bit of a different energy. It's more of that mystical depth of Pisces versus the Cancer, which would be someone who's more expansive and intuitive. People who have Jupiter in the first house have big personalities. Oh my goodness. When they're in a room, you feel that energy, especially in the fire signs, I've noticed. These are people who, tend to take up space, not physically necessarily, although a lot of people blame Jupiter for, weight gain and things like that in the first house. I've noticed that that's not always the case. I know plenty of people, especially with Jupiter in the fire signs, that are very, very thin and remain so their entire lives, but they have big personalities. Like their personality takes up space, not their physical body. And so this could show up in either of those ways. I have noticed when their presence isn't taking up as much space, then their body might take up a little bit more space. And sometimes it's both. It just depends on what Jupiter's doing, right? Jupiter in certain sign placements is more prone to the expansion of the waistline versus in other signs where it's more prone to an expansion of their energy levels, their personality, their enthusiasm, other things. And so you have to look at the chart as a whole, you guys. Pop astrology does not do a good service to any of this. It makes us think that things are just cut and dry, and it tells a lot of nonsense. But that being said, Jupiter people with Jupiter in the first house can be prone to overindulgence. And so if it is an issue of Jupiter expanding the waistline, usually it's because of that indulgent personality where they want to experience life. They want to expand their horizons, lens through their experience. They want to do everything. They want to eat everything. They want to, experience it all. And so that Jupiter energy can make them more prone to excess. It can make people more prone to laziness also. But on the flip side, Jupiter in the first house is considered to be mostly positive when it comes to your physical health and even your physical appearance. People who have Jupiter in the first house tend to just be healthier, and they can get away with abusing their bodies a little bit more and indulging a little bit more because they tend to just have more resiliency and more good luck when it comes to the health of their physical body. And so they're the people that in general through their life, they have these really crazy opportunities that just come to them out of nowhere. They're prone to bouts of luck and good fortune that turn the tides and move them in a different direction in life. And that's not going to be all the whole case for every single person who has Jupiter in the sign or that's not going to be the case for every single person who has Jupiter in the first house all the time. But when you look at their overall big life story, there are these pivotal moments, these major life themes, these major experiences that have a lot to do with luck and have a lot to do with good fortune shining on them and good things coming their way, or them seizing a really important opportunity. That's another big thing. They know how to recognize opportunity because they are so optimistic. They can see a good thing when it comes to them and they can take hold of it. And that's a skill too. That's not just something falling into their lap. Things fall into our laps all the time, but if we don't take advantage of them, then we're not going to be able to do anything with it. It's not going to matter. These people know what matters and they know how to navigate that and how to take advantage of these opportunities because they have that expansive viewpoint, because they have such optimism. And finally, people who have Jupiter in the first house, they tend to be have a really good sense of humor. They're very happy. They're very jovial. And people don't seem to realize, especially upon first meeting them, how intelligent they truly are. These people have lived it. They have been there. They've done it. They've experienced it. And they have a wisdom that's usually beyond their years. They have a wisdom that you can't get from book learning and from, using fancy big words and, all of those types of things. They have a wisdom and a knowledge and an intelligence that is through direct learning and is through direct experiences that they've had. And they do tend to be wise when it comes to things that are more Jupiterian, that are more Piscean and Sagittarian as well. So when it comes to like philosophy and mysticism and the bigger questions about life, Jupiter in the first house people thrive on those questions and they investigate them very deeply. With Saturn in the first house, people who have this placement tend to take on a Capricornian or an Aquarian type of personality in addition to whatever their rising sign might be. And so if they have Saturn in an earth sign, even if it's not Capricorn, although Saturn and Capricorn in the first house will make someone an ultra Capricorn rising, if it's in Taurus or if it's in the sign of Virgo, they'll feel like a Capricorn and they'll look a little bit like a Capricorn rising. When it comes to Aquarius, having Saturn in Gemini or in Libra, and especially in Aquarius, will make them an ultra Aquarius. But it'll give them that more Saturnian side of the Aquarian personality and the Aquarian way of showing up and interfacing with the world. People with Saturn on the ascendant, they tend to be like little old people when they're young, and they tend to mellow out with age, just kind of like a Capricorn rising might. And so they tend to be wise beyond their years when they're very young, and they say things that you wouldn't expect a very young child to say or to know or to understand. And as they get older, they loosen up, they lighten up, but they still have kind of a sternness about them, or this quality of just being very responsible, very practical, they have this quality of being just very responsible, very careful, very calculated in a way that, other placements just do not. Speaking of which, Saturn in the first house people tend to be some of the most perfectionistic people. You think Virgos are perfectionistic? They have nothing on a Saturn first house person, especially in the earth signs, but just in general. These people want to get things right. They have a theme of responsibility. They don't like when other people are not taking responsibility for their actions, for their lives. They don't like not taking responsibility for themselves. They are the responsible ones, and they pride themselves on that, and that is definitely not a bad thing. Sounds boring, but it's actually a very useful skill. But they do tend to be very hard on themselves when they feel like they're not living up to their end of the bargain, when they feel like they are not doing everything that they could possibly be doing. They really want to feel like they're carrying their weight and also carrying the weight of like 10 other people at the same time. If they're not doing that, they're very hard on themselves, and they're very perfectionistic in everything that they do and carry out. They want it to be done exactly the right way. They do tend to be more rule followers and rule breakers, but they'll often use the rules to catapult them into something else. So like a foundation for growing or building off of. So they like to have that kind of lens through which what has worked in the past and then go from there. And that's the Aquarian type of quality too. And because Saturn is a more malefic influence, this can pose some challenges. Their life can be plagued by limitations, restrictions, people saying no. There can be big major life themes around these topics and around just having to be responsible. Usually these people have to grow up at a very young age and become responsible at a very young age. And that's part of the reason why they come across at a very young age as being more grown up than they actually are. They also, tend to have some sort of health issues, especially early on in life. There's an emphasis on bones, teeth, hair, skin, and nails, because those are all things that are ruled by Saturn. Like ossification is ruled by Saturn. There could be issues with that in development, but that could also be a positive influence. So if Saturn is really strong in the chart, maybe it is in Capricorn and it's in this beautiful grand trine. Maybe they have excellent bone structure and their bones are really prominent in a positive way and they're very strong and sturdy. And that can be the case too. So it's not always negative. It just depends again on how Saturn's showing up and how it's playing with the other, characters in the chart. Saturn is a very cool, dry influence, and so with Saturn in the first house, they can be prone to cool, dry conditions in the body, and especially things like dryness in the skin, the nails, and they do tend to age prematurely. Even though they get younger as they get older when it comes to their personality, they do tend to have like this older look about them a little bit earlier on in life. And I've seen that come up, quite a few times. But again, that depends on what Saturn's doing and how it's playing with the chart. If Saturn's really strong and really positive in its influence, it can indicate that they just have a very long, stable, lifespan that's full of good health. Like it doesn't have to be a bad thing. And, that they stay looking good for a very long time. Like it just really, really depends on a lot of different things. Uranus in the first house people tend to be rebellious in all the ways. They do not conform. They are unique in their perspective. They're unique in their appearance. They're unique in the way that they go about engaging with the world. They do things in a way that other people don't understand and they don't have to understand. And their simple presence in a situation, in a room, causes a disruption because they have a bit of an unsettled energy. They are a little bit more prone to impulsivity and erratic behavior, inconsistencies. So like 1 minute they want to be one way and then all of a sudden they decide that they're going to change it and they're going to shake it up and they're going to completely do a 180 and break it all down and do something completely different. And so they're not going to be the most loyal, stable, consistent of friends or employees or whoever it is that they are in your life. Or if that's you, you're just not that. That's not who you are. You're not here to do the same thing day in and day out. You're not here to be like everybody else. You're here to march to the beat of your own drummer and to do things your own way. Independence, liberation, and freedom are key words for you, and you need to live by that. But it can be a little unnerving for some people, especially, let's say, the Saturnian types. People with Saturn in the first house might not like that, they're going on one path and you decide that you're going to change course and throw them off kilter. They might not like that you took on responsibility for something and then you decided, this actually doesn't feel good. This feels like a cage. This feels like a weight and this doesn't feel right to me. I'm going to go do that other thing. But for you, that's what works, right? And so people with Uranus in the first house, they are very uniquely themselves. They tend to pride themselves on thinking differently, looking differently, behaving differently. They tend to pride themselves on doing their own thing in their own way. Because Uranus rules electricity, these people can be a little bit more electrically sensitive than others. You need to be very careful about the electrical system of your body, but also the energetics of your environment. And I don't just mean that in a metaphysical sense. Things like Wi-Fi radiation, EMFs, dirty electricity, living next to a power line. These things affect everybody, but it impacts you and the health of your body way more so than other people. People who have Uranus in the first house also tend to be highly intelligent. They're like geniuses that are ahead of their time. Other people just don't understand what they're doing or why they're doing it because it's so far off into the future, it's so ahead of itself that nobody else is there yet. And eventually you'll be vindicated, eventually you'll be validated, but it might not be even in your lifetime. Uranus in the first house people are the innovators. They are the paradigm busters. They are the people that invent the new and exciting things, that have the outside of the box ideas, that awaken others to possibilities and potentials that they wouldn't otherwise be open to. Neptune in the first house can make somebody highly sensitive. I've known many people with Neptune in the first house, and all of them report being very psychic, very easily able to pick up on other people's energy, and struggling with that, especially early on in life. Because this is such a malleable energy, it dissolves the boundaries of your personality and who you are and the way that you show up in the world, to the extent that it can cause identity confusion or an identity crisis earlier on in life, because you're having a hard time figuring out who you are outside of other people and their energy. It also makes it so you're very easily swayed by other people's influences and energy. And so you do need time that's separate from other people. You do need time in your own space to come back to yourself. You are highly intuitive and you can follow that guidance so long as you are not being swayed by other people, because you're so easily caught up in other people's energy and other people's waves. If somebody is so excited about something that they're just emanating that energy, they're emanating that emotion, you can very easily get caught up in that. And I'm sure you've had this experience, if this is you, where all of a sudden you're doing this thing and you're like, I don't like this. Why did I do this? Oh, it's because my partner or my friend was so excited and I got so excited, and then I couldn't tell that I don't like this, and now I'm doing it, right? And so you have to be careful. On the same token, other people's negative energy can affect you too. And so being very aware of who you're surrounding yourself with, and also like the environment that you're in, because it could even be like, I've had people with displacement clients report that they can go into a room and they can feel like an argument that happened like 3 weeks ago if it was really bad, and they can pick up on that, and then they'll ask people about it and it'll be validated. These are also people that can very literally have paranormal experiences much more readily, because they're so sensitive to other dimensional realities, to other energies, to things that the normal sensory experience just doesn't encompass. And so that can be a little scary and a little frightening early on. And so these people are very sensitive, and they can become anxious if their sensitivities are not cultivated in the right way, if it's not approached the right way. They can also become very anxious just getting caught up in what's going on in the world around them or with other people around them. It can be very unsettling. And so having really good boundaries and really good energetic practices is very important for Neptune in the first house people. They tend to be very creative, and so that could be a really positive manifestation of Neptune in the first house. They have this creativity that other people just can't tap into, that's very deep. It's not creativity just for the sake of making something beautiful or pretty, like with the Venus energy, which can be more aesthetic or more about the sensory experience. It's creativity to give voice or give imagery to something that goes beyond explanation, because they're so tapped into these impressions and these other realities. Because they are more sensitive, they're more sensitive to everything. So if you have Neptune in the first house, you're more sensitive to poisons, which includes things like plant medicine that can also, be toxic, or pharmaceutical medications. Especially people who have Neptune in the first house tend to have a lot more sensitivities, a lot more allergies in general too. And so you just have to be more careful about what you're putting into your body physically. And because they are so sensitive and they're picking up on all these other dimensional energies, they are more prone to certain mental health diagnosis, I've noticed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a mental health origin. And so when we're looking at this holistically, we're looking at this from the lens of astrology, we know it's because they don't have as many energetic boundaries, and so they're picking up on things that other people might not be picking up on. These people make really excellent psychics, really excellent healers, really excellent artists. Anything really that requires a deep understanding of something or a deep intuition about something. And finally, a placement that I have a very personal connection to, Pluto in the first house. People who have this placement can come across as being very intense and also very hard to read. One of the things I noticed that I didn't realize that I also do when I was giving chart readings, or when I was first giving chart readings, was that all of my Pluto in the first house, and especially Pluto on the ascendant clients, were so hard to read energetically, emotionally. Normally, I'm very good at reading people, and that's part of having Pluto in the first house. You're very good at really getting down to the truth of things. Your bullshit detector is like on fire. You're very easily able to read the subtle nuances and expressions, and you can tell when somebody's behavior, what they're saying, is very disconnected from their emotions. You're like a human lie detector. But when it comes to other people who have Pluto on their ascendant and in their first house, I found them to be unreadable and a little bit intimidating. Especially because I was doing chart readings for them, and even though I was telling them I could read their chart, I couldn't tell how they were reacting to anything. And so especially as a new astrologer, that was a little bit scary. I thought that they hated it. I thought that they didn't think I was doing a good job. And then they would come back at the end and be like, oh my God, that was amazing. Like later on, they'd ask me follow-up questions and I'd be like, oh, phew. They didn't hate it. They didn't hate me. It was just the fact that they had Pluto on their ascendant. And that actually made me realize something about myself that I didn't know before, that I can be the same way. When I am so focused on something, when I am very concentrated on what somebody is saying, I have this very intense stare and my face becomes completely unreadable. My energy becomes completely unreadable, and that can be intimidating. I've had people comment to me certain things about that in the past that I never quite understood until I had that experience of somebody else with Pluto on their ascendant. And so that's one of the qualities of Pluto on the ascendant. But Pluto on the ascendant people can be intimidating because they're unreadable, and they can be very intense, especially when they're very focused on something, when they really want something, when they're just really paying attention to something, and that can be a little off-putting to people. They tend to be very magnetic, so Pluto is very black and white. People are either very drawn to the energy of Pluto on the ascendant, or they're very repelled by it. So they find these people either scary, or they don't like them in some way, they find it off-putting, or they love it, and they are just drawn to you like a magnet. That is that Pluto on the ascendant energy. People with Pluto on the ascendant can be very intense manifestors too. They're very good at drawing in what they truly need, want, and desire, but they have to truly desire it at a core level. It's not like they can just be like, oh, I want $1 million, but it's not deeply what they want. What they deeply want is maybe a sense of security, or what they deeply want is something entirely different. They can draw in what they deeply desire, and they'll know if it's what they desire or not. And if they really don't want something, they can repel it just as easily. And so there is this power, this magnetism, this psychic power that comes with that Pluto intensity on the ascendant, and really on any of the angles. People with Pluto on the ascendant are also typically very resilient. They can come back from the brink of death, and I've seen that in a lot of charts. They can come back from things that are seemingly incurable or impossible to overcome. They can overcome obstacles and situations and come back feeling much more empowered in ways that other people just couldn't handle it when it comes to difficult life experiences as well. And so this is an energy of regeneration and of resiliency. These are also truth seekers, and so they can really get to the bottom of something, not just being like a lie detector, but they tend to be obsessive with whatever it is that they feel passionate about. They are obsessed, and they will be single-minded, and they will go down that rabbit hole, and you'll not be able to pull them out because they are so laser focused on getting to the bottom of something. These are excellent researchers. These are excellent psychologists. These are excellent detectives. These are people that are going to figure it out, and they love to do it too. They can go on these tangents, on these rabbit holes, and it's very hard to break them out of it. And they don't like their concentration to be broken when they are in that focused mode. And one of the reasons too, kind of backtracking to that intensity and that ability to really read other people, is usually because they dealt with a lot of intensity in their early childhood experience. And so they had to learn how to read other people. They had to learn who had the power and what the power dynamic was, because Pluto is all about power. And so they learned how to take that power and use it for themselves. They learned how to read, you know, what other people were feeling and what their nuances of their behavior, because it was a defense mechanism. It was a protective mechanism. It's not always the case with Pluto on the ascendant, but oftentimes it is the case. And finally, people with Pluto on the ascendant, they require a good amount of solitude. They're going to be very secretive and very self-protective about a lot of things. They're not going to open up about their private life very easily and very readily. They're slow to trust, but once they do crave that depth of connection and that depth of conversation and that depth of intimacy. But until they're there, they're not going to open up all the way. And even once they've gotten there, there's stuff that they're going to keep hidden. Pluto is all about secrecy, and it's about bearing things, and it's about putting up that shield. And so that can be, you know, a little difficult for some people. But Pluto on the ascendant people, they're not doing that because they're trying to like hurt other people. They're doing it because there's an intense discomfort, and there's this really strong urge to just keep things to themselves and to keep to themselves sometimes. And so, yeah, it's a whole thing of being just unreadable and like not super open about things, which I'm not hating on Pluto on the ascendant people for that, because obviously I have that too. I get it. And so that is all of the planets in the first house. If you haven't already done so, make sure you check out my free workshop all about becoming a confident astrologer in less than 1 year. That's happening again on April 30th. I hope to see you there. Make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and share this with your friends who have planets in their first house so they can learn a little bit more about themselves too. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.